Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Vanishing of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Keepers. Introduction. On a lonely speck of rock off Scotland's northwest coast, a lighthouse beam once sliced through Atlantic gales to guide passing ships. In December of 1900, that beam suddenly went dark. When a relief vessel finally landed on the remote Flannan Isles, its crew found the lighthouse eerily silent and abandoned. Beds were unmade, a cold stove held no fire, and a stopped clock ticked no more. The only sign of life was a quiet canary in a small cage. The 3 keepers stationed there had vanished without a trace. What unfolded in the ensuing investigation became one of maritime history's most haunting mysteries: the disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers. In this episode, we journey through that mystery in a gentle, meditative manner. We'll explore the background of the Flannan Isles and their lighthouse, the daily lives of the keepers, and the detail of their unexpected vanishing. We'll delve into official reports, witness accounts, and even the folklore and wild theories that have sprouted in the centuries since. Settle in for a thorough, unrushed exploration of the enigma, a story as vast and deep as the ocean that surrounds Island Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles. In this narrative, we will refrain from sudden shocks or loud surprises. Instead, we'll maintain a calm, documentary tone, illuminating each facet of the story gently and comprehensively. Imagine the steady sweep of a lighthouse lamp, slowly revealing every part of the scene, one detail at a time. Chapter 1. The Remote Isles of Mystery. Far in the Atlantic, about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, lies a small cluster of uninhabited islands known as the Flannan Isles. Locally, they earned the nickname the Seven Hunters, 7 rocky inlets ceaselessly pounded by winds and waves. The largest of these inlets is Island Moor, a grassy-topped rock that rises sharply from the sea. Over centuries, Island Moor gathered a reputation for being a strange, even sacred place. The Isles are named after Saint Flannan, an Irish monk from the 7th century, said to have lived on Island Moor as a hermit. Legend holds that Saint Flannan built a tiny stone chapel on the island's slope. Indeed, the ruins of an ancient chapel still sit not far from the modern lighthouse. Because of this holy association, and perhaps because of the island's formidable isolation, local people long regarded the Flannan Isles with superstitious awe. For generations, fishermen and shepherds approached Eilean Mo with a mix of reverence and fear. Shepherds from Lewis would occasionally ferry sheep to graze on Eilean Mo's rich grass, but none ever stayed overnight. The moment dusk approached, these men would hasten to depart, sheep in tow, unwilling to remain after dark on that enchanted isle. They spoke of a watchful spirit on the island, an unseen presence that made its displeasure known to any intruder. According to lore, anyone stepping ashore was to immediately remove their cap and circle the ruins of St. Flannan's Chapel clockwise in a show of respect. Even hardened sailors whispered of wee folk or other supernatural inhabitants. Tales circulated of ghostly lights dancing above the cliffs and giant phantom birds guarding the rocks. In the imagination of the Hebridean community, these remote rocks were alive with magic and mystery. This aura of sanctity and fear was so strong that when plans arose in the late 19th century to build a lighthouse on Eilean Mo, some islanders muttered darkly that disturbing the wee folk or the spirit of St. Flannan would invite misfortune. Building a permanent structure and housing men there year-round, would, they warned, unleash St. Flannan's wrath? It is an ominous bit of hindsight, perhaps, given what later transpired. But in the 1890s, the pressing need for a lighthouse outweighed these ancient superstitions. The seas around the Seven Hunters were simply too dangerous to leave unlit. Indeed, sailors had long feared the Flannan Isles for entirely practical reasons. The surrounding waters were a graveyard of ships. Jagged reefs lurk just under the waves. And unpredictable Atlantic storms bring walls of fog and towering seas. Many a ship foundered on these rocks, scattering timber and cargo along the nearby coasts of Lewis and Harris. Such wrecks meant not only loss of life, but also loss of valuable goods. By the 1890s, maritime traffic around northern Scotland was increasing, and the region's authorities knew that a lighthouse on Eilean Mo can save lives. So it was decided the Northern Lighthouse Board, the agency responsible for Scottish lighthouses, would tame Eilean Mo's wildness with engineering and light. In doing so, they inadvertently set the stage for a legend. Chapter 2. Building the Lighthouse. Constructing a lighthouse on a forbidding, uninhabited rock was no small feat. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was designed by David Allen Stevenson, a member of the famous Stevenson family of Scottish lighthouse engineers, the same family that produced novelist Robert Louis Stevenson, who grew up among these engineers. David Allen Stevenson was an experienced engineer, but even he noted the challenges. There is little protection from the Atlantic swell, which is seldom at rest, he warned. Indeed, Eilean Mo offered virtually no natural harbor and scant shelter from ferocious wind. Work began in 1895. For 4 years, workers toiled under often desperate conditions to erect the lighthouse and its associated structures. Every single piece of material, massive blocks of stone, cement, iron rails, a lantern room, and even fresh water and coal, had to be brought by ship and then hoisted up the cliffs. The Isles cliff soar about 150 to 200 feet high, around 45 to 60 meters, nearly vertical in places. To facilitate construction and later supply deliveries, the crew built steep staircases and a little railway system on the island. Steel tracks were laid down from the planned lighthouse site toward two landing points, one on the eastern side and one on the western side of the island. Using a small steam-powered winch, carts could haul heavy supplies up these inclines. The rail line even had a switch point partway called Clapham Junction, humorously named after the busy London railway junction, where one track forked to two different landings. The men often worked in miserable weather. Atlantic gale could spring up suddenly, lashing Eilean Mor with rain and monster waves. During construction, an entire landing crane was ripped away by a stormy sea. This happened even at a height of 70 feet above the waterline, a testament to how fierce the ocean could be here. Such incidents underscored the need for the lighthouse, but also the peril of the location. Despite all difficulties, the lighthouse was completed by the close of 1899. It cost about £1,899, a huge sum then, equivalent to several £100,000 today. The tower stands 23 meters, or 75 feet tall. A white masonry cylinder attached to a keeper's cottage building at its base. Atop the tower, a powerful oil-burning lamp was set behind a rotating Fresnel lens. The light would sit at about 100 meters, or 330 feet, above sea level when shining, high enough to be seen roughly 20 nautical miles out to sea in clear conditions. On December 7, 1899, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was lit for the very first time, its double flash piercing the winter night. Islanders on Lewis could faintly see the new light on the horizon. Many must have felt relief, knowing this beam would help prevent shipwrecks. Yet perhaps some remembered those old warnings about the spirit of Saint Flannan. A Gaelic poet on Lewis wrote a satirical piece at the time, joking that the ghost of Saint Flannan might march up the lighthouse, demanding to know why modern intruders had disturbed his domain. Little could anyone guess that within 1 year, the keepers of this light would disappear, and the island's eerie reputation would only grow. Chapter 3. Life on a Lonely Rock. For the men tasked with keeping the Flannan light burning, life was rugged and regimented. Typically, such a lighthouse had a crew of 4 keepers assigned, 3 men on station at any given time and 1 on relief on shore. The keepers would rotate shift such that every so many weeks 1 man got leave to return to the mainland while another took his place. This rotation helped break up the monotony and strain of isolation. Even so, stints on Avon Moor were lengthy, often 4 to 6 weeks at a time, sometimes longer if weather delayed the relief vessels. The 3 men on the island followed a strict routine. They lived in the Lighthouse station's quarters, a stout stone house attached to the tower. Each keeper stood watch in shifts to ensure the light was lit from dusk till dawn and kept in good order. At dawn, the night's keeper would extinguish the lamp, and everyone would begin the day's chores. These included cleaning the lantern lenses, refilling the lamp's oil reserves, polishing brass, recording weather readings, and maintaining equipment. There was also domestic work, cooking meals, cleaning the kitchen, and tending to any livestock or pets. Some lighthouses kept chickens or a cat. At Flannan, they had at least a canary for companionship. The men also kept a logbook, noting the weather, sea conditions, any passing ships, and routine detail like when the light was lit or extinguished. This log was an official record to be sent back to the Northern Lighthouse Board. For jotting quick notes before transferring to the formal log, they often use a slate, a kind of erasable chalkboard, especially when weather observations were made outside or when multiple tasks were happening at once. During downtime, keepers might read, if they had books or newspapers brought from shore, write letters to family, or simply converse and tell stories. But on such a tiny island, there were limited diversions. There was a small store of provisions delivered by the relief ship, salted meat, flour, tea, canned foods, enough to last until the next scheduled supply run. Fresh water came from a rain-fed cistern or from what they brought in. Stormy weather could be especially challenging. The whole station would tremble when Atlantic waves struck the cliffs. Winds howled around the tower, and sometimes freak waves sent spray clambering right up to the lighthouse itself. The keepers had to be self-sufficient and steady in nerve. They knew help was far away if anything went wrong. In emergency, they had a system of flag signals to communicate to watchers on Lewis, but that assumed someone was looking at the right time. At night, if the lamp failed, their only recourse was to fix it. They had no radio to call for help. Wireless telegraphy was still in infancy and not installed at remote lights yet. The isolation was total. Just 3 men, facing nature's fury with only their wits and each other. By December 1900, the lighthouse had been operating for just over 1 year, and its crew consisted of the following men: James Ducat, principal keeper. At 43 years old, James Ducat was the head keeper. He was a seasoned lighthouse man with over 20 years of experience in the service of the Northern Lighthouse Board. Ducat had served at multiple lights. His longest stint had been nearly 8 years at Rins of Islay Lighthouse, a remote station off western Scotland. In April 1896, his solid record earned him a promotion from assistant to principal keeper. He was selected to be in charge of the brand new Flannan Isles Lighthouse, a post of great responsibility. Colleagues knew Ducat was reliable and steady. Back home, he had a wife, Mary, and 4 young children. By late 1900, they were ages 16, 13, 9, and 6. One can imagine that after decades of service, Ducat was likely used to the separation from family that lighthouse duty required, but the Flannan Isles posting must have been one of his most remote assignments yet. Thomas Marshall, second assistant keeper. Thomas Marshall was around 28 to 30 years old in 1900. He had been a seafarer, an occasional lighthouse man before formally joining the Northern Lighthouse Board in April 1896 at age 27. Marshall's record noted he had served as an occasional keeper on Ailsa Craig, a granite rock island lighthouse in the Firth of Clyde, before coming to Flannan. This suggests he was accustomed to isolated rocks. Described as diligent, Marshall nonetheless had a recent blemish on his record. At some point prior to December 1900, an equipment mishap had occurred under his watch. According to later research, Marshall had once been fined 5 shillings, a not insignificant sum for him, when some of his gear was washed away in a gale. This incident likely preyed on his mind. He would not want to lose equipment and pay ever again by being unprepared for a storm. Donald MacArthur, occasional keeper. Donald MacArthur was serving as a temporary replacement on Flannan. The station's regular first assistant, William Ross, had fallen ill on shore, so MacArthur was assigned to fill in. Unlike Ducat and Marshall, Donald MacArthur was not a full-time lighthouse keeper, recorded in the service register. He was an occasional, meaning he was hired on a temporary basis, likely because he had relevant maritime experience. MacArthur was an older man. Some reports suggest he was in his mid-40s, around Ducat's age, though his exact birth year is unclear. He was a former sailor and was known back home as a tough, seasoned mariner. In fact, local lore describes MacArthur as having a bit of a fiery temperament, a hardy, brawling sort who wouldn't shy from a fight if provoked. He too had a family, a wife and 2 children, in a village, though records are a bit thin. Correspondence at the time confirms a wife and kids awaited his return. Because he was temporary, MacArthur may have felt extra pressure to prove himself useful and reliable during his duty. Joseph Moore, assistant keeper, relief man on shore. Joseph Moore was the fourth member of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse team, but he was not on the island at the time of the disappearance. In early December 1900, Moore was on relief rotation. He was scheduled to go back to Eilean Mor to resume duty, replacing one of the three men there, around the 20th of December. By all accounts, Moore was friendly with the others. He had been with them during the lighthouse's commissioning. In fact, Superintendent Moorhead, who oversaw the lighthouse operations, later noted that he had visited the station on December 7, 1900, for a check that he shook hands with each of the men, Ducat, Marshall, MacArthur, and Moore on that day as they completed a routine crew relief. Moore left with Moorhead on the relief boat that 7th of December, expecting to rejoin his comrades in a couple of weeks. Little could Moore or anyone know that by the time he returned, he would find the lighthouse empty. The assignment at Flannan Isle was considered a challenging one, not just for its remoteness, but also due to lingering local superstition. It's said that initially, it was hard to recruit keepers for this station from the local populace. Many men were hesitant to serve on the haunted isles. Ultimately, the Northern Lighthouse Board placed men who were experienced and perhaps less swayed by the old legend. Men like Ducat and Marshall, who had served elsewhere. Yet even practical seamen could feel the uncanny atmosphere of Eilean Mor. Later on, Joseph Moore would confess that upon his first return to the deserted lighthouse, he felt an unmistakable sense of dread and eeriness in the empty rooms. The island's reputation for spookiness was not lost even on modern eyes. But we jump ahead. First, we must recount what happened in those mid-December days when Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur were alone on the rock, tending the light. Chapter 4. The Last Recorded Day. Winter storms had been sweeping the North Atlantic. On the Flannan Isles, the three keepers carried on their duties through rough weather. The official lighthouse logbook, kept up until 13th of December, gives no indication of anything unusual. The last routine entries were for 13th December 1900, and they apparently noted nothing beyond typical operations. For 14th December, we know that the men did their normal chores because of what was later found. On a slate in the lighthouse, they had jotted down the day's observation, barometer reading, thermometer readings, and notes on wind, intending to enter them into the logbook later. They even noted the time they extinguished the light on the morning of the 15th, and the weather at 9 a.m. that day. All of this suggests that up until the morning of Saturday, 15th December 1900, life at the lighthouse was proceeding routinely. The work of that forenoon, or morning, was carried out. The lamp was cleaned and refilled, the lenses polished, the station tidied up. Someone, Likely Marshall, as second assistant often did kitchen duty, had scrubbed the pots and pans and cleaned up after the midday meal. The beds were left unmade from the night before, as they typically would be aired out during the day. In short, everything was in its proper place, giving no hint of alarm. Until the events of that afternoon. Something occurred on 15 December in the late afternoon that caused all three men to leave the lighthouse and never return. The evidence discovered later allows us to piece together a likely timeline. Sometime after lunch, which would have been around 12 or 1 p.m., the keeper seemed to have gone outside, perhaps down towards the west landing of the island. We know this because when the lighthouse was found empty later, 2 sets of heavy outdoor gear were missing, Ducats and Marshalls. And the third set, MacArthur's oilskin coat, was left hanging indoors. This indicates that Ducat and Marshall put on their sea boots and weatherproof coats, preparing to go out into foul weather, while MacArthur apparently rushed out in only shirt sleeves, leaving his coat behind. Why would all three men abandon the lighthouse together, when rules strictly require at least one man to stay behind at all times to watch the light? Therein lies the heart of the mystery. Lighthouse protocol was clear. No matter what, one person must remain in the lighthouse if others went out, especially in dangerous weather. Breaking this rule suggests a scenario urgent enough that even a seasoned principal keeper like Ducat felt it necessary for everyone to respond. The prevailing theory, which the subsequent official investigation would support, is that the men had noticed something at the west landing that demanded immediate attention. The west landing was a crude platform and cranes set up on the more exposed side of the island. Supply boats could unload there in calmer seas, but in heavy swell, the west landing took a terrible pounding. It's possible that on 15th of December, after enduring days of stormy conditions, the keeper saw or heard that some equipment down by the west landing was in peril or had already been damaged. Perhaps a storage box containing ropes and tackle had come loose, or a rail was warped and threatening to break loose. They might have seen from atop the cliffs that something was amiss at the landing, such as the bin of mooring ropes precariously displaced, and realized if they didn't secure it, essential gear or the crane itself might be lost to sea. Another possibility often mentioned is that they heard a strange noise or felt a shock from the west side, prompting them to investigate. Some suggest one man, maybe Marshall, eager not to lose equipment again after his fine, initially went down to check, and when he didn't return promptly, the second, Ducat, followed to assist, and finally MacArthur, perhaps seeing a gigantic wave on the horizon, or hearing his colleagues shout, dashed out last in such haste that he didn't even grab his coat. Whatever the exact trigger, By evening of 15th December, the lighthouse lamp was never lit. Normally, at sunset on the 15th, one of them should have climbed the tower and ignited the beacon, ensuring its life-saving flashes went out into the darkness. That night, the light stayed dark. We know this because of a critical external observation. At about midnight on 15 December 1900, the steamer Arctur, sailing from Philadelphia to Leith, passed by the general vicinity of the Flannan Isles. Arctur's crew noted in their log that the Flannan light was not visible, even though weather was rough and they were looking for it. They found it odd and concerning that no light was seen where one should have been. The seas were high and visibility was poor, but a functioning lighthouse ought to have been glimpsed between squalls. This was the first sign that something was wrong, though at the time, Arctur's crew couldn't immediately report it as they were mid-journey. Only when Arctur docked in port in Leith on 18th December was the information passed along to the Northern Lighthouse Board. Back on Avon Moor, by the end of December 15th, whatever had happened was likely over. The three keepers had vanished, presumably swept into the sea or otherwise killed that same afternoon or evening. The lighthouse sat unwatched, its lamp dark, through the following days and nights. One can imagine the eerie sight, a brand new lighthouse meant to be a beacon of safety, standing cold and unlit while waves crashed and seagulls cried. On the nearby Isle of Lewis, a man named Roderick Mackenzie had actually been assigned a duty to watch for the Flannan light from afar. He was a gamekeeper on the coast of Lewis, across the 20 miles of water, and the Northern Lighthouse Board paid him a small fee to be a sort of part-time lookout. Each night, Mackenzie would check if he could see the tiny gleam of Flannan's light on the horizon. However, seeing a lighthouse that far away was always subject to weather, and Mackenzie wasn't a trained lighthouse keeper. Throughout mid-December, poor weather often obscured the view. According to later reports, Mackenzie's log noted that the light was not seen on the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th of December, possibly due to storm or fog. It was seen on the 12th, then not seen again on subsequent nights up to Christmas. He was growing concerned by the long gap, and by 24th to 25th of December, he had even asked some of his neighbors to help scan the horizon, wondering if the lamp was out. Still, he did not immediately raise an alarm to the authorities, likely attributing it to continuing bad weather. With hindsight, we know the light was indeed out from the 15th onward. Mackenzie later expressed that if a full-time lighthouse signalman had been ashore, as some stations had, an alert might have been raised sooner. But as it stood, Christmas came and went, with the Flannan light extinguished, and no one yet had reached the island to find out why. Chapter 5. The Discovery. The relief ship was finally on its way. The Northern Lighthouse Board's supply tender, Hesperus, had originally been scheduled to sail from Lewis Shore Station on 20th of December to bring Joseph Moore back to the lighthouse and take one of the 3 men off for leave. However, severe weather that week prevented the voyage. Gale force winds and high seas made it impossible for the small tender to make the crossing to Eilean Mor on the 20th. Day after day, the Hesperus was delayed. It was not until the morning of 26th of December, the day after Christmas, that Captain James Harvey, master of the Hesperus, felt conditions were calm enough to attempt a landing. The Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles around noon. As the ship approached the landing, those on deck looked up at the lighthouse for the usual signs of welcome. Normally, the routine was that keepers would spot the tender and hoist a flag, and prepare the landing by sending down a cargo basket on the crane. This time, no flag was flying on the flagstaff. There was no movement whatsoever on the station. Captain Harvey sounded the ship's whistle and then blew the steam siren, sending echoes across the cliffs to announce their arrival. Silence. No reply signal came from the lighthouse above. Growing concerned, Harvey next fired off a signal rocket, a customary way to get attention if a lighthouse crew hadn't noticed a ship's arrival. A burst of bright noise and smoke shot into the gray sky. Still no response from the island. Those watching through binoculars saw no figures emerging from the lighthouse compound. The island looked deserted. Fearing an emergency, Harvey prepared to launch a boat. The seas around the Flannans were still choppy from winter swells, and landing even in good weather was tricky. The tender maneuvered to the more sheltered east landing, the leeward side that day. A small rowboat was lowered, and Joseph Moore, the returning keeper, volunteered to go ashore first. One can imagine Moore's anxiety. He had been anticipating reuniting with his colleagues, perhaps exchanging belated Christmas greetings and hearing how they fared in the bad weather. Now, a dread was creeping over him as he climbed into the boat with 2 seamen at the oars. They pulled towards the east landing. Normally, at least one of the keepers would be down the landing to help secure the boat. This time, only emptiness greeted them. The landing stage showed no welcoming party, no lines readied. The boat had to be carefully back into the pier because of the surge. With some difficulty, Moore managed to jump ashore onto the slippery steps. He told the 2 sailors to wait at the jetty while he ran up alone to the lighthouse compound. The climb from the landing to the lighthouse is steep, over 150 stone steps, zigzagging up the cliff. Moore hurried up those steps, passing the tiny chapel ruins and the windy rail tracks. When he reached the lighthouse entrance gate, he found it closed. He unlocked the gate and proceeded to the main door of the living quarters. This too was closed, latched shut. There was an inner door beyond the entrance leading into the kitchen. That inner door he found standing open. Stepping inside the kitchen, Moore was struck by the stillness. The scene that met him was unsettling in its normality. The fireplace was cold. No fire had been lit for a few days. A partly eaten meal was not sitting on the table, despite what later myths would say. Moore did not report any food set out. In fact, the kitchen was clean and tidy. Dishes had been washed, provisions stored. A chair might have been out of place. Some accounts mentioned a chair overturned, but Moore's own report did not note this. That detail seems to have come from later imaginative retellings. The key facts Moore observed: the beds were emptied and unmade, just as they would be if the men had gotten up that morning and never returned to sleep. The clock on the wall had stopped, indicating that it had wound down, likely sometime not long after it was last wound. Lighthouse clocks were typically wound regularly, so a stopped clock hinted at days of neglect. There was no fire in the grate, no simmering stew or boiling kettle on the stove, nothing to suggest any recent activity. And of course, no voices, no footsteps, no welcoming shouts, just an uncanny quiet, broken only by the distant surge of waves outside. In one corner, a small yellow canary in a cage sat silently, alive, but likely hungry. This little bird was the only living soul Moore found in the lighthouse. One imagines its gentle twitter was a lonely sound in that deserted station. Moore's heart must have pounded as he quickly checked each room, calling out the names of his friends: James, Thomas, Donald. No answer, only hollow echoes. He noted the lamp in the lighthouse tower was prepared and ready to be lit, its wick trimmed, oil refilled, mechanics cleaned. Evidently, it had been made serviceable on the 15th for the next lighting, but never ignited. This confirmed that whatever happened to the men likely happened in the afternoon of the 15th, after all their morning work was done, but before evening duties. Finding no one inside, Moore felt a swell of panic. He sprinted back down the path to the east landing to report what he had found. Breathlessly, he told the two sailors waiting in the boat that the lighthouse was empty. "They're gone," he may have exclaimed, worried that perhaps the others hadn't looked thoroughly. The second mate, Mr. McCormick, and a seaman joined Moore in a second search. Together, they scoured the lighthouse building top to bottom and even checked the compound's outbuildings. It only confirmed the obvious. The keepers were nowhere on Eilean Mor. They returned to Captain Harvey aboard the Hesperus with the grim news. Harvey, then organized a party to stay on the island and keep the light in operation, since night was approaching and the lighthouse could not be left dark any longer. Joseph Moore, though shaken, insisted on remaining to do his duty and light the lamp. 3 volunteers stepped forward to assist him. The boy master, Mr. Allan MacDonald, who happened to be along for the trip, and 2 seamen, Campbell and Lamont. Harvey put these men ashore, 4 total including Moore, to hold the lighthouse station. The Hesperus crew even lit a fire in the hearth and prepared the lighthouse for that night's service. At dusk on 26 December, for the first time in 11 days, the great lamp was lit again by Moore's hand, and its white beams revolved once more over the dark seas. Before departing, Captain Harvey composed a telegraph message to send to the mainland at the first opportunity. It read in part, "A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the occasional MacArthur, have disappeared from the island. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs, or drowned trying to secure a crane, or something like that." Harvey's message conveyed both the facts and his immediate hypothesis. He suspected they had been swept away by the treacherous weather while tending to something at the landing. He noted in the telegram that the clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago, confirming his belief that it occurred around the 15th. Harvey dispatched this telegram when Hesperus returned to port, and it was forwarded to Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh. News was now out that 3 lighthouse keepers were missing, presumed dead. Back on Eilean Mole, over the next day, 27th of December, Joseph Moore and the volunteers continued to look for any clues. They roamed over the island's plateau and down to each landing. At the east landing, they found everything in order, exactly as it had been left after the last routine supply drop on 7th of December. Coiled ropes, crates, and other equipment there were untouched. This indicated that whatever happened was focused on the opposite side, the west landing. When Moore and the others examined the west landing area, they encountered startling evidence of recent storm damage. The west landing is essentially a naturally formed inlet, or geo, a narrow gully in the cliffs, with a concrete platform and crane at the water's edge. A steep tramway leads down to it from the station above. Now they saw that this part of the infrastructure had been shattered by violent waves. An iron railing that ran along the path and near the crane was bent and twisted out of shape. A heavy box that had been kept about halfway up the slope, used for storing coil of rope and other landing tackle, had been smashed open and displaced from its cranny. Its contents, buoyed ropes, mooring lines, were found strewn about the rocks, some even entangled up on the crane platform. But notably, the ropes were still neatly coiled, suggesting they hadn't been unwound by human use, but rather washed out by water force. The crane itself was intact, but the wooden crane handrail and a life buoy had been fastened nearby were gone. Upon close inspection, they found the ropes that secured the life buoy were snapped, with bits of canvas still clinging to them, implying a wave had hit so hard it tore the life buoy off by sheer water power. This life ring had been 110 feet above sea level on a path railing. Even large pieces of rock had been displaced. A stone weighing perhaps a ton had been dislodged from higher up and deposited onto the path near the bottom of the cliff steps. Turf and soil had been ripped away from the edge of the cliff top above. Observers later noted that the ground 200 feet above sea level showed scars of where waves or wind had torn at the grass as far as 30 feet inland from the cliff's brink. In short, the west flank of Eilean Mor had been ravaged by something extremely powerful, likely a series of massive waves during a storm. This evidence gave weight to Captain Harvey's initial guess. It looks as though an exceptional rogue wave had struck the west landing, wreaking havoc. Amidst this wreckage, there was no sign of the men themselves, not a shred of clothing washed up, no tools dropped, no trace of their bodies. It was as if they had been plucked off the face of the island by the sea and swallowed into oblivion. Joseph Moore found one more telling detail during the search. On the path above the west landing, he discovered MacArthur's raincoat still hanging on its peg back in the lighthouse, but no corresponding coat for Ducat or Marshall. This confirmed what he first realized indoors. MacArthur had probably ran out without his coat, while the others suited up for bad weather. Additionally, Moore recalled that Ducat and Marshall only ever wore their heavy sea boots and outdoor gear when going down to the landings, not around the house. And indeed, both men's sea boots were missing. To Moore, this all but shouted that the trio had gone down towards the west landing together and met disaster there. With heavy hearts, Moore and the volunteers completed their tasks. They ensured the lamp was lit each night, and they waited for further instructions. The outside world now knew of the tragedy, and soon a proper investigation team would come to the island. Chapter 6. The Official Investigation. The disappearance of the keepers prompted a prompt inquiry by the Northern Lighthouse Board. They dispatched Robert Moorhead, the Northern Lighthouse Board's superintendent for that region, and the very man who had recruited and known all three missing keepers, to investigate. Moorhead arrived at Eilean Mor on 29th of December 1900 to take charge of the situation. Moorhead brought additional relief keepers to temporarily staff the light, as Moore was emotionally shaken and alone with two inexperienced seamen. After ensuring the lighthouse was in stable hands, He set about carefully examining every detail of the scene and interviewing those who had first discovered the disappearance. He spoke with Captain Harvey and Mr. McCormick of the Hesperus, with Joseph Moore, and with Alan MacDonald, the buoy master, taking their statements about what they found. Moore had confirmed all of Moore's initial observations. Inside the lighthouse, nothing was disturbed or missing, except the men and the outdoor gears mentioned. The kitchen was clean, dishes put away. The only meal remnant were in the storeroom, the staples of their diet. So the idea that a half-eaten meal or still warm porridge had been left out was a later myth. In truth, everything suggested they had finished a normal midday routine. The last logbook entry was on the morning of 15th of December. There were no mysterious final words written, simply routine data waiting to be transcribed from the slate. Moorhead noted that the lamp was prepared and ready for lighting on the evening of the 15th, indicating again that the keepers had completed their work up until that critical point. The clocks being stopped meant that likely since about the 15th or 16th, nobody wound them. This gave another clue to timing. Accompanied by Moore and the others familiar with the island, Moorhead inspected the landings. The east landing was unperturbed, important because it suggested no departure by boat was made from there had the keepers tried to escape in the station's boat. One would expect some disorder at a landing. The station's small boat was actually still in place, tucked safely and not launched. Therefore, the men did not leave the island intentionally by sea. Down at the west landing, Moorhead took in the full extent of damage. Railing bent, the iron tramway track torn from its concrete mooring in place, the life buoy yanked off, the smashed storage crate and strewn ropes, the massive displaced stone, all confirming a gigantic force of water had recently hit. He was an experienced lighthouse man himself, and remarked that some damage was difficult to believe unless actually seen. Moorhead also confirmed the clothing evidence. Ducat's body was likely in sea boots and a waterproof coat. Marshall had sea boots and oilskins on, and MacArthur had only shirt sleeves. This led him to conclude exactly what Moore had, that the two first went out prepared for foul weather, and the third rushed out later, inadequately dressed. He then carefully considered various possibilities. Importantly, Moorhead recognized that leaving the lighthouse unattended was a breach of regulation. This meant something extraordinary had to have compelled all three to be outside together. He surmised the men wouldn't have abandoned their post lightly. Given what he saw, the most logical scenario was this. Sometime in the late afternoon of 15th of December, Ducat and Marshall went down towards the west landing to secure the equipment and perhaps that box of ropes that had come loose. They likely knew a storm was worsening and feared more items would be washed away. Perhaps the weather had eased just enough that they thought they could quickly check the moorings of the crate or crane between squalls before dark. MacArthur stayed behind initially, since one man should remain in the lighthouse. Maybe he was up in the tower or in the kitchen tidying. Then something happened that drew MacArthur out too. Perhaps he saw a freak wave about to hit and dashed out to warn them, or he heard a sudden crash or cry for help from his colleagues below. All three ended up in a vulnerable spot near the water or on the path above it when an extra large roller, an unexpected huge wave, struck the island. Eyewitnesses at other remote lights have described how waves can run in series, one or two big ones, then a truly enormous one. This wave, as Moorhead described in his report, likely rushed up the face of the rock, went above them, and then came crashing down with immense force, sweeping the men away into the boiling sea. In his official report, dated the 8th of January 1901, Moorhead wrote, "From evidence which I was able to procure, I was satisfied that the men had been on duty up till dinner time on Saturday the 15th of December, that they had gone down to secure a box in which the mooring ropes, etc., were kept, and that an extra large sea had gone above them, and coming down with immense force, has swept them completely away." He specifically considered and then dismissed the idea that wind alone had blown them off the cliffs. He reasoned that the wind that day, while severe, was westerly, meaning it would have pushed them up the island, not over the edge, if it caught them. A man might drop to the ground and cling on if buffeted by wind, but a wave coming from below could easily knock them off their feet and carry them away before they could react. Given the localized damage and missing life buoy at 110 feet elevation, the wave theory fit best. Moorhead also noted that one of the keepers, likely referring to Marshall, had indeed been fined previously for losing equipment in a storm, which would have made them more anxious to secure gear this time. This detail adds a very human element to the tragedy. Could it be that Marshall's desire to avoid another reprimand led him to take a deadly risk? It's haunting to consider. He further reported that no bodies were ever found. The sea around Flannan is deep and full of current. If the men drowned, their bodies may have been trapped in underwater crevices or carried far away. Occasionally, drowned bodies will wash ashore eventually, but in this case, none of the three ever did, adding to the mystery and sorrow for the families. Moorhead ended his report with personal sorrow. He had known these keepers well, and had even shared a parting handshake just a week before their disappearance. He wrote about how the board had lost some of its best men, and how heartbreaking it was that their fate would likely never be fully known. He also recorded a thoughtful note that Joseph Moore was deeply distressed by the whole affair, very nervous, he said, and that he arranged for one of the seamen to stay with Moore for a time at the lighthouse to give him companionship on those lonely nights after the incident. If Moore could not recover from the shock, Moorhead suggested he might have to be transferred to a less isolated post, though Moore's knowledge of Flannan was valuable. Indeed, Moore did eventually leave lighthouse work not too long after. One can imagine the trauma stayed with him. Finally, Moore had touched on a point of procedure that this disaster highlighted: the lack of fast communication. He mused that if wireless telegraphy, radio, had been in place, perhaps they could have discovered something was wrong sooner. But even then, he admitted, if they got no response from a wireless, they might have amused the apparatus faulty rather than all 3 men gone. He also reconsidered the notion of daily signal, that is, requiring lighthouses to send a daily visual signal of all well to observers on shore. Ironically, he noted that in this case, constant fog and haze had prevented any signals from being seen in that time frame, so even a daily check system might not have raised the alarm earlier. In essence, the tragedy was a confluence of timing and circumstance. It happened just after a relief visit, so nearly 2 weeks went by before discovery, during a period of bad weather and holiday when normal communications lagged. The 3 missing keepers were officially listed in the record as lost at sea, 15 December 1900, presumed drowned. The local register of deaths later recorded their date of death as on or about 15 December, with cause probably drowning. For their loved ones, this was a devastating and conclusive loss. Ducat's wife and 4 children, and MacArthur's wife and 2 children, were left without husbands and fathers. Thomas Marshall's elderly father and his siblings mourned him. The Northern Lighthouse Board likely provided compensation or pensions to the families, a small solace for an event that had no clear culprit or closure. With the investigation concluded, the lighthouse was restaffed. Life had to move on at the Flannan Isles light, though it would forever carry the weight of this mystery. In fact, Moore had mentioned that the reputation of the lighthouse was tarnished for some years. As one might imagine, subsequent keepers approached the assignment with trepidation, and local gossip deemed the rock cursed or jinxed. The board had to reassure and carefully select new crews to serve there after 1900. Chapter 7. Rumors and Theories Begin. As news of the keeper's disappearance spread in early 1901, it captured the public's imagination. This wasn't just a local story. Newspapers across Britain and even overseas in America reported on the strange affair at the Flannan Isles. People were struck by the eerie scenario: 3 men vanishing from a remote island, leaving behind an intact station. The press naturally played up the mystery. In the absence of survivors or witnesses, newspapers and individuals began to offer theories, some sensible, others outlandish. A few common ideas emerged in those first weeks and months. Giant wave, the accident theory. Many believe the official conclusion that a freak wave or series of waves had swept the men away. Given the evidence of storm damage, this was the most straightforward explanation. Some reports focused on the geography of Avon Moor, how narrow gullies can amplify waves. The West Landing cave idea was discussed. A cave at the end of the gullies might have funneled a wave that then exploded out, catching the men off guard and washing them off the cliff. Experienced sailors nodded grimly at this theory, knowing the sea's caprice. Violent wind, the accident variant theory. A few suggested that maybe an intense gust of wind had actually done it. Could a mini tornado or sudden squall have literally blown the keepers off the island? Some lighthouse veterans recounted how winds in these regions could lift heavy objects. One anecdote told of a keeper who was knocked off his feet by wind while carrying a heavy box. Perhaps the men were investigating something outside and a powerful blast of wind channeled between structures hurled them over a 200-foot cliff. Author Keith McClaskey, in later research, pointed out this possibility, noting that the living quarters were only about 30 feet from a sheer drop. Step outside in a gale at the wrong angle, and one could be airborne. However, the counterpoint to this is the lack of any sign of struggle or attempt to hold on. Also, typically one man would not leave without a coat if going out into a known gale. Illicit boat, escape or abduction theory. Some early speculation wondered if the keepers might have left intentionally. Perhaps they had signaled a passing boat, for instance, if some emergency at home arose or they wanted to desert, and departed the island. Could it be they staged their disappearance to start new lives somewhere? Or more sinisterly, were they coerced? There were whispers of foreign spies or pirates. Remember, this was 1900, not wartime, but imperial rivalries existed, and tales of espionage were in the air. Maybe some thought a foreign vessel landed secret agents who eliminated the keepers to use the lighthouse for nefarious purposes, though what purpose is hard to say. It sounds far-fetched, but such theories were printed in some papers. Another version imagined that perhaps smugglers or unsavory characters came ashore and the keepers fell victim to them. Sea creature, fantastic theory. In an era fascinated by sea serpents, the Loch Ness Monster legend was percolating, and sailors often reported strange beasts. A few speculators mused that a sea serpent or giant sea creature might have snatched the men off the rocks. As fanciful as it sounds, Victorian and Edwardian readers were no strangers to such wild ideas in the press. If giant squids could drag down boats, another popular notion then, why not a leviathan grabbing lighthouse keepers? No evidence for this, of course, but it made for lurid reading. Ghost ship or supernatural, local folklore theories. In the Hebrides, some locals quietly advanced a supernatural explanation. The keepers were taken by the phantom of the seven hunters. This referred to a legendary ghostly presence said to haunt the Flannan Isles. One version of this story talked of a phantom ship crewed by ghosts that sometimes passed those rocks. It may be that haunted vessels spirited the men away. Others muttered it was revenge from the spirit world for intruding on St. Flannan's sacred ground. Perhaps the old saint or the wee folk, fairies, led the keepers into another realm as punishment. In effect, the island's dark reputation seemed to have manifested in a dire curse. It's notable that locally, this was actually a widely held belief. Many residents of Lewis and nearby isles truly thought something not of this world was responsible. For years after, few crofters or fishermen would go near the seven hunters without uttering a prayer. Foul play among the keepers. Murder theory. Another grim theory was that the men fell out among themselves. Could one of the keepers have gone mad or become violent, killing the others and then himself? Given that one of them, MacArthur, had a reputation as short-tempered, suspicion in armchair investigations often pointed to him. Maybe MacArthur, isolated and stressed, snapped, possibly even committing murder. One scenario envisioned MacArthur getting into a fight with, say, Marshall over something trivial, or during the height of a storm when nerves were frayed. In the struggle, one man could have been fatally injured, and the fight could have spilled outward towards the cliffs. Perhaps two grappled and fell to their deaths, and the third, horrified, either jumped or was also pulled in. Or if one was a murderer, he might have disposed of his colleague's body in the sea, and then, in remorse or to evade consequence, leapt off the cliff. There was absolutely no proof of any such altercation. No bloodstains, no signs of a weapon or fight. But in the absence of bodies, this theory remained in play in many minds. The isolation and psychological pressure of lighthouse life made it a tantalizing storyline. As these theories swirled, a detail emerged in the press that seemed to bolster the more dramatic interpretations. A logbook with strange entries. Around 1912, some articles in later storytellers claimed that the Flannan Isles Lighthouse log or diary had contained disturbing last entries by Second Assistant Thomas Marshall. According to these tales, Marshall wrote on 12 December about a severe storm, the likes of which I have never seen in 20 years, noting that Principal Ducat had been unusually quiet and that big tough MacArthur had been crying with fear. Then, on 13 December, he supposedly wrote that the storm was still raging and that all three men were praying in terror. Highly odd, since experienced keepers would know the lighthouse was relatively safe. Finally, an alleged entry on 15 December read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." These entries, if true, painted a picture of men driven to the edge of sanity by a supernatural tempest, only to vanish after calm returned, implying something nearly paranormal at work. However, no such log entries were ever found in reality. The official log had nothing of the sort. Remember, it stopped on 13th of December without incident. The storm described in those apocryphal entries didn't match known weather. There were no huge storms on 12th through 13th of December, according to meteorological records. And in fact, years later, researchers tracked these diary entries to a likely source. They appear to have been a fictional embellishment, first appearing in a 1920s or 1960s magazine, which then got repeated as fact. In 2017, historian Mike Dash closely investigated and confirmed that these colorful log excerpts were fabricated after the fact to sensationalize the mystery. But in the early 20th century, many took them at face value. If the keepers were that frightened, people reasoned maybe something unearthly was happening on that rock. Or perhaps one of them truly lost his mind. Thus, by a decade after the incident, the Flannan Isles mystery had grown into a full-blown legend, with facts and fiction intermixed. Chapter 8. Later Investigations and Modern Theories. Over the many years since 1900, numerous investigators, both serious researchers and enthusiastic amateurs, have revisited the Flannan Isles case, hoping to find new clues or offer fresh explanations. While the official wave hypothesis remains the most accepted, and indeed was deemed the cause in all formal records, other theories have been refined or proposed, often addressing perceived gaps in the wave explanation. Let's explore these theories from the logical to the fringe with an open mind. Natural accident theories. These attribute the disappearances to an unintended encounter with nature's forces, aligning with no human malice or intent. Rogue wave, large roller theory. This is the conclusion Superintendent Moorhead drew and is supported by the physical evidence. In essence, a combination of circumstances, perhaps the men being in a vulnerable spot on a lower ledge or near the edge, and an unusually large wave hitting the island, resulted in them being washed away. Modern experts note that rogue waves far larger than the surrounding swell, can indeed occur even when a storm is subsiding. Such waves could have been generated by distant storms and arrived unpredictably. The Flannan Isles topography with narrow geos can amplify wave height by focusing energy. The strength of this theory is that it matches physical damage observed. It fits timeline. And it's straightforward and no need for conspiracy. The weaknesses are that it requires all three to be caught together. One might ask, why all three? Possibly, as discussed, one in trouble and the others went to help in a tragic chain. Skeptics also point out that keepers knew to be wary of waves. Would Ducat and Marshall really go down in such conditions? If daylight was fading and sea raging, some argued they'd postpone action, but perhaps they thought it was urgent and a lull in the weather misled them. Overall, this theory remains the most plausible and is generally considered the truth story by most lighthouse authorities. Sequential wave rescue theory. A slight variant of the above, suggested by later lighthouse staff like Walter Aldeburgh, who served on Flannan in the 1950s, posits that the men might not all have been hit at exactly the same time. Perhaps one man, Marshall, went down to the very landing to move the box. A wave comes and knocks him into the sea. The second man, Ducat, horrified, rushes down to help, maybe climbing down the ladder or getting close to the edge. And a second wave or a sudden surge takes him too. Finally, the third, MacArthur, who stayed up until that point, sees the emergency and dashes out only to be caught by yet another huge wave, or perhaps slips on the saturated grass and falls over the cliff while looking down. In this scenario, each man is lost one after the other in quick succession. It explains why all three ended up victim, even though normally one would stay in safety. Each was reacting to the other's peril. It also matches Aldeburgh's Occam's razor view of one accident leading to another. It's essentially the same outcome as the official theory, just with a phased timeline. It's quite plausible and not really in conflict with evidence, just another way it could have happened. Freak wind gust. Proposed by researcher Keith McCloskey and others, this theory suggests a sudden, extremely powerful gust could have physically blown the men off the cliff near the lighthouse. The idea is that maybe they were together inspecting something like a crane or shutters near the edge, and a gale force squall funneled through the buildings, catching them off guard. As fantastical as that sounds, winds in the Outer Hebrides can be incredibly fierce. McCloskey points out that heavy objects and people have been lifted by winds in documented cases. If the men were perhaps running to retreat from a wave and standing near the cliff, a gust could have finished the job. A wind doesn't leave direct physical trace like water does, which could explain the lack of certain evidence. It also addresses why they might be at a height. Maybe they weren't all down at the low landing, but up top when taken. The damage on the west side, twisted railings, moved rock, strongly indicates water impact rather than just air. Wind alone likely couldn't rip a heavy life buoy off its rope as found. Water plausibly did that. Also, had wind blown them off from near the lighthouse, it's a bit coincidental that it happened to all three at once, since one can't entirely rule out a combination of wind and wave, a deadly mix that day. Lightning or rockfall. A few have idly speculated that if one of the men was struck by lightning or a freak accident like a collapsing piece of cliff, if one was hit by lightning, the others might rush to help and maybe fall. But there's no sign of such an event. A rock fall could explain the moved boulder, but that was likely wave-driven, not spontaneously fallen. These are quite unlikely compared to wave action. Mercury vapor poisoning, a madness theory. Here's a more unusual hypothesis that have emerged in some discussions. Lighthouse lenses in that era floated on a trough of mercury to allow nearly frictionless rotation. Over time, mercury exposure in a closed environment can cause symptoms of poisoning, including tremors, irritability, and hallucinations or madness in extreme cases. Some wondered if one keeper could have been affected by mercury fumes and gone insane. For example, maybe MacArthur, the one with the fiery temperament, experienced mercury-induced delirium, ran out into a storm in madness, and the others chased him only to be dragged into danger. It's true that mercury was present and long-term keepers sometimes did suffer ailments. It also gives a possible cause for aberrant behavior if any occurred. It's speculative, though, and has no evidence in this case. No reports prior that the men were acting strangely, and the timeline is too tight. They'd only been on station a couple of weeks since last leave, not enough for acute poisoning effects. Additionally, this would normally cause chronic issues rather than a sudden bout of insanity. So while chemically possible, it's a fringe notion. Human-related theories. These consider that intention actions by people, the keepers themselves or others, led to the disappearance. Conflict among keepers. As earlier mentioned, one theory is that a personal quarrel or fight led to deadly consequences. Consider the stresses, isolation, perhaps one keeper drinking, though official rules forbade alcohol on duty. We don't know if they had any for Christmas, maybe. Personality clashes. MacArthur was rumored to be quick-tempered. Marshall was younger and maybe could irritate the older men. Ducat, as principal, might have had to discipline the others. One imaginative scenario. Perhaps MacArthur and Marshall got into an argument while outside, maybe one accusing the other of negligence causing the fine, and Ducat rushed out to separate them. But a scuffle on a slick path sent all three over the edge. Or worse, what if one deliberately harmed the others? If MacArthur had, say, stabbed or knocked the others and tossed them into the sea, he could then have been seized by guilt or fear and jumped. Or one could have accidentally killed the other, and then horrified, orchestrated a scenario to hide it. Human violence is not unheard of in extreme isolation. There are other tales from history of lighthouse keepers coming to blows. Even one case in Wales, small lighthouse in 1800, where one keeper died and the other went nearly mad tending the body. So it's not beyond possibility that tensions could have boiled over at Flannan. But again, no physical evidence, no blood, no weapon, no signs of a struggle found. Also, it would be peculiar for a murderer to clean up absolutely everything, including signs on land. All indications were that they left in an orderly way, not in a chase or fight inside. It's also a bit of a stretch to imagine one man hauling two bodies to the sea by himself in a short time, or that all three would end up over the cliff due to a fist fight. Still, novelists and films have loved this theory or its dramatic potential. The 2018 film The Vanishing portrays a version of events where greed and violence between keepers played a central role. Voluntary escape, desertion. Another suggestion was that the keepers perhaps wanted to leave. Could they have planned an escape from their posts? Perhaps one or all were unhappy, though nothing obvious suggests that. Ducat had decades of service, unlikely to throw it away, and they left families behind. Still, some posited maybe they arranged for a boat to pick them up clandestinely, intending to disappear and start fresh lives. In such a case, they'd have had to make it look like an accident, which could include maybe faking a scene of being swept away. It's hard to find any strengths to this theory. The men had stable lives and jobs. It would be a very elaborate ruse. If they had left by boat willingly, why do it in such conditions? And how to ensure they were never spotted later? Also, they left their personal belongings and even their outer clothes in MacArthur's case. Families never heard from them again, and 3 men colluding to vanish at once is even less likely. Usually one might desert, but convincing the others, or accidentally all 3 being complicit, is near zero probability. So this theory is generally not taken seriously, but it did appear in newspaper musings at the time. Abduction or outside foul play. This includes theories like foreign spies, pirates, or other ne'er-do-wells landing on the island. Perhaps a ship with a small crew came to Flannan for some reason, maybe to sabotage the lighthouse or to hide from authorities, and encountered the keepers, leading to a deadly altercation. Could the keepers have been murdered or forced to leave at gunpoint? There was an anecdote in one newspaper that perhaps a shipwrecked crew from elsewhere landed on Flannan and in desperation killed the keepers, though why they wouldn't then use the food and shelter rather than vanish is unclear. Or perhaps a Navy press gang. In earlier century British ships would impress men, but in 1900 that wasn't practiced. There was also mention in a few writings of a ghost ship specifically, an apparition or a pirate vessel, known in lore, which ties back into supernatural. But some took ghost ship to mean an actual boat of evildoers. This theory acknowledges that we don't have bodies, so an external removal like kidnapping could account for that. If some criminal element removed them via boats, their bodies wouldn't be found on the island or at sea. Consider the logistics though. Any boat landing would have to manage in heavy seas unnoticed by Mackenzie on shore, who saw no unknown lights or signals. The keepers likely would have resisted. Signs of struggle might remain. And for what motive? Spies or criminals have easier targets than remote Lighthouse. Also, historically there's no record of any such incident in that area then. This leans into conspiracy more than reality. Paranormal or alien abduction. While not part of the original 1900 to 1901 speculation, people then thought more of ghosts than aliens. In modern times, some have whimsically added extraterrestrials to the list of possibilities. For completeness, UFO enthusiasts have at times claimed maybe a UFO whisked the three men away. Of course, there's absolutely no evidence for this, and it's more of a tongue-in-cheek addition to the canon of wild theories, often mentioned alongside sea monsters as an example of extreme ideas. Similarly, the idea that a curse or ghost literally spirited them to another dimension falls into this basket. Only strength is that it underscores how unexplained the mystery feels, that some resort to otherworldly answers. But there's no evidence, and this theory veers into fantasy. It's safe to say such ideas, while sometimes raised in books or TV shows for intrigue, are not seriously considered by historians. Other factors to consider. One detail often pondered is that Moore found the compound gate and outside doors closed. If the men left in a hurry, would they really pause to shut the door behind them? Perhaps if going down to face a storm, they would secure doors to prevent wind from ripping them off hinges. It indicates they weren't so panicked that they ran out wildly. They left in an orderly fashion, likely expecting to be right back. It's a small detail, but suggests they left the lighthouse calmly, not in a blind rush, with the exception of MacArthur not taking his coat, but even he might have pulled the inner door shut behind him out of habit. No alarm raised. Another notable aspect is none of the keepers signaled for help. There were high visibility balls or discs that could be hoisted on the tower to signal distress to shore. Moorhead had discussed them with establishing a daily all-well signal, but it wasn't in use. In their final days, no signal was shown. If, say, one man was injured or sick earlier, the others could have signaled. The fact that nothing was communicated suggests whatever happened was sudden and gave them no chance for planned reaction. Psychology. Those who study group psychology in isolation note that generally 3 is an unfortunate number in terms of social dynamics. With 2, you have a pair who must get along. With 3, sometimes alliances form or one person feels left out. We don't know of any discord among Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur. Indeed, there's evidence they were competent and professional. But it's an interesting tangent that many lighthouse crews were in 3s, and the dynamics could be complex. The principal may have felt paternal. Marshall might have looked up to him. MacArthur, being an outsider temporary, could have felt insecure. Or conversely, MacArthur, the oldest and not a career keeper, might have been a bit of a fish out of water under Ducat's command. We will never truly know if there was interpersonal stress that contributed indirectly to decisions made that day. Given all available information, in over a century of analysis, most experts and authors conclude the simplest explanation stands. A tragic accident likely involving the men being swept into the sea by a freak wave while performing their duties. Yet, the very absence of definitive proof means alternative theories continue to hold a corner of public's imagination. Notably, subsequent research, like that of author James Love in his A Natural History of Lighthouses, reinforced the wave theory by uncovering the bit about Marshall's prior find, reinforcing why they'd be extra cautious with equipment. Every piece of concrete evidence we have aligns with an accident, but the haunting nature of an empty lighthouse invites storytelling, and so the legend persists, enriched by each new theory. Chapter 9: Aftermath and Legacy. In the wake of the tragedy, the Northern Lighthouse Board took steps to memorialize and learn from it. The families of Ducat and MacArthur received what support the Northern Lighthouse Board offered. Likely small pensions or gratuities were given to the widows to help raise the children. The empty place at Flannan Station was filled by another keeper. Someone had to keep the light burning. Indeed, operations resumed quickly. The next relief came and went normally, though one can imagine every keeper stepping onto that rock thereafter felt a shiver remembering their fallen colleagues. For years, Flannan Isles Lighthouse had a hard time shedding the story. Keepers stationed there reported that the island carried a somber mood. Some said an overwhelming sense of melancholy hung in the air. It's easy to attribute that to knowing what happened here, perhaps psychological, but possibly also the island's inherent loneliness taking on the cast of tragedy. According to anecdote, future lighthouse crews would occasionally leave offerings at the little chapel ruins, perhaps unconsciously appeasing whatever spirits might roam. There is an often cited account that each new set of lighthouse keepers on Flannan, upon arrival, would do a small ritual at St. Flannan's Chapel, just as those shepherds of old did out of respect or superstition. It wouldn't be surprising. People often revive rituals when faced with the unknown. The lighthouse itself continued in service. Over the decades, it withstood countless more Atlantic storms. Remarkably, no similar incident occurred there again. Improvements in communication gradually reached lighthouses. By mid-20th century, many remote lights had wireless sets and later even telephones or radio links. Ultimately, in 1971, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was fully automated, and the last lighthouse keepers departed the island for good. One wonders if the automation engineers gave a nod to the ghosts of the past as they installed machines where men once toiled. Since 1971, Aylon Moor has been uninhabited, except for maintenance visits. The lighthouse still stands, solar-powered now, silently flashing its warning to ships, an enduring legacy of the Stevenson engineers. Visitors occasionally land, weather permitting, perhaps a few tourists or researchers, but it remains a difficult place to reach. Those who do visit often report a feeling of awe and somber reflection. The emptiness of the station, the knowing that 3 men met their fate here, certainly leaves an impression. Some claim you can still sense the presence of the keepers and the sound of the wind around the tower. Naturally, such feelings are subjective, but the story has unquestionably woven itself into the fabric of maritime lore. The mystery of the Flannan Isles keepers has inspired numerous artistic works and popular references. One of the earliest was the poem Flannan Isles, 1912, by British poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson. Gibson's poem, published just over a decade after the event, is a haunting ballad from the perspective of the relief crew. In it, he vividly describes finding the lighthouse deserted, with meal laid out, untouched, and a chair knocked over on the floor. The poem ends on an eerie note, emphasizing the utter absence of the keepers and the unanswered question of their fate. Gibson took some creative license, notably the untouched meal and toppled chair, which have no basis in Moore's actual account. His lines, "We only saw a table spread for dinner meat and cheese and bread, and no one there, as though when they sat down to eat, ere they could even taste, alarm had come, and they in haste had risen and left the bread and meat, for at the table head a chair lay tumbled on the floor," conjure a powerful image of sudden abandonment. This imagery was so effective it seeped into many retellings as if it were fact. In truth, as we know, the table was likely cleaned and cleared, but Gibson's fictionalized scene cemented itself in the legend, symbolizing the abrupt, unexplained nature of the vanishing. To this day, many who've only heard a little about Flannan Isle recall the untouched meal, a testament to the poem's influence. Music and stories followed. The progressive rock band Genesis, in 1968, recorded a song called "The Mystery of Flannan Isle Lighthouse," weaving the tale into lyrics, though it wasn't released until decades later. Composer Peter Maxwell Davies wrote a chamber opera titled "The Lighthouse," premiered 1980, loosely based on the Flannan events, adding his own supernatural twist to the narrative. The mystery has popped up in TV and literature. For instance, an episode of Doctor Who, the serial Horror of Fang Rock 1977, transposed a similar disappearance to another lighthouse with a sci-fi explanation, clearly inspired by Flannan's story. More recently, the tale continues to fascinate. The 2018 psychological thriller film The Vanishing, mentioned earlier, used the Flannan premise as a jumping-off point to imagine what might have happened during those fateful days, in that film's case involving hidden treasure and violence between keepers. Author Emma Stonex, in 2021, published The Lamplighters, a novel heavily inspired by the Flannan mystery, but setting it in a 1970s context with her own fictional trio of keepers, again exploring various theories through a narrative lens. The enduring appeal of the Flannan Isles disappearance is evident. It touches on our primal fear of the unknown, the loneliness of remote places, and the thin line between safety and catastrophe. Interestingly, even outside the arts, the incident had some practical legacy. lighthouse authorities worldwide took note of the disaster. Over time, safety protocols were revisited. For instance, better rain gauge for predicting rogue waves, insistence on never all leaving the lighthouse. In later installations, if possible, there were redundant means of access so keepers wouldn't congregate in one risky spot. Communication improvements like radios were eventually introduced, partly spurred by the recognition that months could pass before finding out something was wrong. Some even say the tragedy influenced the push towards automating lighthouses in the long run. If no keepers had been there, no lives would be lost. Of course, that's the technological inevitability anyway. But it's poignant that by the time Flannan lights went automated, it removed the human element that had made the story so resonant. For the families of the lost keepers, there was sadly never full closure. In such maritime losses, the absence of a body often prolongs hope, or at least unsettles the finality. Mary Ducat and Lily MacArthur, Donald's wife, likely clung to whatever comfort they could. Perhaps every so often, one of the children would gaze out to sea, imagining their father somehow survived on some distant shore. But as years passed, they would have accepted the truth that the sea had claimed their loved ones. In the nearby island communities, the Flannan tragedy became a fireside tale. Old fishermen would recount to youngsters how the light just went out one night, and when they went to see, the poor fellows had vanished. Some might add the spirits took 'em, while others would shake their heads and say, nay, it was the sea. The 7 hunters earned an even more forbidding reputation, and no doubt this contributed to a mystique around lighthouses in general. These solitary towers where brave souls contend with nature. In a touching gesture, the Northern Lighthouse Board's official historian in recent times has said that while the mystery fascinates, we must remember these were real men who lost their lives in the line of duty. They weren't characters in a ghost story, but husbands, fathers, sons. The board commemorates them in its record, in history displays. At the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters in Edinburgh, the Flannan Isles disappearance is marked as a somber chapter in their proud history of keeping the coasts safe. Chapter 10. Conclusion. Over 120 years have passed since the 3 keepers vanished from Flannan Isle. Yet the story lives on, undimmed by time. Perhaps it endures because it sits at the intersection of fact and folklore, where hard evidence meets enduring mystery. We have the facts of broken railings and stopped clocks, but not the certainty of how or why at that precise moment those men were where they were. The seas around Alon Moor still crash and foam as they did that December day. The lighthouse still stands, now watching over an empty rock. In a sense, the lighthouse itself is a poignant metaphor, a solitary sentinel shining through darkness, much like we try to shine reason into the darkness of unknowing that surrounds this case. Picture the scene now in your mind's eye. The winter sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows from the white tower on Avon Moor. The constant wind sweeps over the green slopes where sheep once grazed and tugs at the old chapel stones. Down by the western cliff, waves boom into the geo, sending up spouts of spray. Among those wet black rocks are perhaps the very ones where Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur drew their last breath, doing their duty against the elements. You can almost see them in the mist, 3 figures in oilskins, one holding onto his hat in the gale, another bracing a wooden crate, the third shouting a warning, and then a giant wall of water, white and relentless, rising up behind them. In an instant, when the water falls and retreats, the men are gone. Only the sound of the wind and surf remains. Such a visualization might be close to the truth, or perhaps not at all. We will likely never know the full final moments of the Flannan Isles keepers, but what remains is a sense of respect for their dedication and empathy for their plight. They stand in for all lighthouse keepers and seafarers who risk and sometimes lose their lives in the unforgiving sea. In the quiet hours, if you ever stand on a shore in the Outer Hebrides and gaze westward, you might just spot a tiny flicker on the horizon, flashing every 30 seconds. The Flannan light, still faithfully doing its job. It flashes now in memory of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, the men who once kept it shining and who left an enduring light in history through their mysterious fate. Sleep now, knowing that even the darkest mysteries eventually find some peace as the light continues to sweep over the waves for the safety of all.